This is the Converging Perspectives podcast. My suspicion is that a lot of these issues that we have of political polarization today are rooted in religious thinking on both the right and the left. And these religious ways of thinking somewhat inherently push against each other and polarize, or sort of like root into, well, our beliefs are correct and those other ones are blasphemous. And that is why we keep splitting apart, even though our values might actually be much closer together than we realize.
Well, I think that linking our current travails to the history of the role of religion in American society is absolutely on point. And because so few of us actually remember our history, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the role of religion in American society was one of the fundamental tensions in the founding of the country. Today, a lot of folks who are very religious feel that religion is under attack, and that somehow the separation of church and state was about attacking religion, marginalizing it, diminishing it, demeaning it. And in fact, the original intent of having the separation of church and state was to protect religion from the state. And unless you can get behind the history and remember the flow of the religious struggles and wars that were going on in Europe, you don't appreciate the genius of what it was that the founding fathers tried to set up to disestablish a religion while establishing a state that would tolerate and allow for any and all religious beliefs to exist without being trampled, and found treasonous, which is what was happening in Europe. So I think it's critically important to go back and emphasize again the fact that although we were not founded as a Christian nation, we were founded as a nation that saw the importance of religion, and furthermore saw the damage that can be done to religion when it is taken over by the government. And a uniform approach given to the populace, enforced by the government, so that everyone has to believe in exactly the same way, or face banishment, being burned at the stake, excommunication, whatever the punishment may be. Right. And there was a lot of punishment.
A lot of people on the right who will say today that they believe this country was founded as a Christian state, that all of the founders, the framers of the Constitution were Christians, and that we should return to the Christian values from which we've started. And you're saying that isn't true.
Well, you could say that nominally most of the founders, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the original senators and cabinet members, had Christian backgrounds for the most part, because they were all coming from countries where Christianity was the state religion. However, most of them did not identify strictly as Christian. Many of them, including people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, identified themselves as deists, which is already a step removed from that kind of either puritanical or traditional Protestant Christianity, where you have a very humanized God, God the Father, God the one who oversees your every step and watches the fall of the sparrow, etc. For deists, the God was more of a principle or a force in the world, a moral force within the human breast, a natural force within the world around us. So already there is a separation philosophically between the kind of Christianity that we see in the religious right today and the kind of Christianity or religious sentiment practiced by the early founders of the country. And that's important. That's an
interesting distinction, for sure. The other argument that I hear, and the history that most people have heard, is that Puritans were fleeing Europe from England and from other countries because the Catholic Church or the English Church would not allow them to practice their religion the way they wanted. But isn't that an issue of a religious theocratic order forcing people out and to come to the United States, and a huge plurality of religions formed in the United States when they got here? Not just one form of Christianity, right, but dozens and dozens. Yes. And if any one of them took supremacy and then said, no, this is the Christianity we all follow, and tried to enforce it, that would destroy the whole concept of a place that is free to practice whatever religion you want.
Exactly. So since we have a majority of founding fathers coming over from England, Scotland, Ireland, you have to remember that for 500 years, since the time of Henry VIII, you had the papal decrees, i.e. the Roman Catholic Church, fighting with the Church of England, established by Henry VIII. And the number of heads literally that rolled and bodies that literally were broken and burned at the stake because of those religious differences is just frightful. I mean, the history of England, depending on which ruler got into power, you either were slaughtering Protestants or you were slaughtering Catholics. And it went back and forth for decades and decades and decades. And part of what was so important to the founding fathers was making sure that did not happen, which is why they did not want any one religion established, because they were afraid that once a religion gets established, those who didn't agree or who saw a different way were going to be the ones who ended up imprisoned or beheaded. And they just had enough of that kind of bloodshed. So the idea of the freedom to express one's religious sentiments in a way that was deeply personal and deeply private was really one of the cornerstones of this nation. And I think we need to remember that as such an important principle, especially when we're seeing things like, the brand new Texas law that says the Bible is going to be taught in the public schools. It's just astounding that they're willing to undo something as fundamental as the freedom for everyone to express or not express a religious opinion and not have anything forced down your throat.
So I want to dive into belief itself, because it seems to me that the reason why we're so polarized is because people have just chosen to believe the narrative that they want to believe and deny the narrative being presented to them, even if there's a lot of facts attached to it. They're like, fake news. I'm not going to listen to that. And I think what the psychology seems to show us is that belief is not primarily about truth seeking for most people. At the biological level, belief is about connection to your tribe. It's about feeling bonded so that you feel safe in your tribe, that we all agree on the same ideology. And that creates what we know is tribalism or groupthink, this kind of desire for a tribal supremacy, that our side is the smarter, more logical, or we have the secret truth, and everyone else is oblivious or stupid or somehow sinful. And that this is the mentality we're seeing now manifested in the political realm quite clearly on both sides, right? Because conservatives, some conservatives are Christians, some of them aren't. But they definitely think woke liberals are crazy and trying to push through some horrible Sodom and Gomorrah version of dystopian reality. And the people on the left basically see themselves in this sort of Enlightenment era, secular and somewhat religious notion of a new utopian order that also may not be the truth, but they adhere to it and they feel bonded around that, and they look at the right as completely backwards and going backwards.
So connecting the idea of belief with the underpinning psychology is the important question to ask. What is the nature of belief? And fortunately, we have a lot of interesting data on that. Some contemporary, but I actually would like to go back about 125 years and pick up William James, the great American philosopher William James, whose deep dive into the varieties of religious experience is one of anybody's top 10 list of books that set the stage for the American culture. The William James book, Varieties of Religious Experience, is always on those lists because it is such a phenomenally important study. It is one of the first truly ethnographic studies, because what he's saying is, I'm not going to ask about theology and organized religion. I'm going to go to the individuals and ask them what their experience of religion and their own beliefs are. And so these lectures that he gave around religious experience are just mind-boggling. Even today, the amount of research that he did is quite astonishing. But he points out something very interesting towards the end of this series of lectures. He says, there are two ways of looking at belief, and people often equate them and see them as one equals the other, but that is not true. In the theory of knowledge, he said there are two ways to look at religious belief. One is seeking the truth. The other is avoiding error. And some people will say, right, those are the same thing. No, said William James, they are not at all the same thing. Those who actually seek the truth are always the ones who are in solitude, seeking something alone, which will immediately alienate them from whatever groups they belong to. And looking at it historically, these are often the ones who end up on trial, excommunicated, beheaded, what have you. Think of Galileo Galilei, a man who sought the truth. And even in his scientific efforts, it was a very spiritual quest that he was on. He was trying to understand God's creation. But his quest for truth came up in a fundamental way against the tribal beliefs of the Pope and the cardinals, who were simply trying to avoid the error of testing anything, believing anything that was outside of the canon of established truth, right? They weren't seeking truth. They had no interest in seeking truth. They were only interested in preserving the belief system that they had all signed on to. So for them, as you were calling it, the tribalism of belief was by far the most important goal. It was not trying to find truth at all. So right. Seeking truth and avoiding error are two very different things. And if you genuinely seek truth, you will have to do it on your own, because you will discover right away that in order to seek truth, you have to loosen the hold of tribal beliefs in order to be a seeker. It's by very definition. You have to let go of whatever belief systems are currently colonizing your mind in order to be open to your direct personal experience and the evolution of new hypotheses to try to support what you are experiencing in your own psyche, in your own body, in your own mind, in your own cognition.
Yeah. I think it's important to discuss at this point, because a lot of people listening may be thinking, oh, that this whole conversation is making me uncomfortable right now, because yes. I have spent years cultivating a belief system that is familiar to me. I have a lot of people who agree with me, and I don't want this to be tested. I don't want to rip this up and expose it. And I guess I want to lean us into just the feeling around this. We have instincts, right, that are telling us, ooh, that idea scares me.
Yes.
And this idea makes me feel calm. These instincts are valid. They're not invalid just because some smart philosopher guy over there told you they're not true, right? It's like, of course, that's not going to work for you. Some philosopher. For some people, there's thinking types, and that's really that's the place where they're going to craft their beliefs. But for most of us, that's not where we craft our beliefs. It's at a feeling level. It's linked to stories, mythical stories that really deliver. Like, oh, that story was so powerful. It felt so true to me. And I agree with it. I believe it. I think that it's important to be willing to dig under the surface of this, to ask the question, are these feelings, these instincts me? Or are they just universal psychology playing with my mind in a unique way? Now, Jonathan Haidt, moral psychologist, did this foundational work called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Disagree on Politics and Religion. And he shows you that it's very similar. Once again, there's like these ideologies that we're holding on to are really built on moral foundations theory, that there are basically 5 moral foundations that he could trace across all cultures. And they are, first, the care harm principle, or the compassion principle, that I don't want harm to come to other people. Now, liberals apparently have this dialed up to 11, as he likes to say. Then there's the fairness principle, which has been researched in psychology. It's universal. People go to fairness. My personal theory is that they don't get there until they actually have to choose how to slice that pie. Who gets the bigger slice of pie isn't up to them. Then fairness is very important to them. But in any case, fairness, universal value, right? Everyone cares about that. Liberals maybe a little bit more than the conservatives. Then you have the value around authority, which is important to conservatives, but it's really important to everybody if you really think about it, because authority creates a structural system of laws you can follow and trust, and that you're not just going to be bullied or have your goods stolen tomorrow, because there is a structural system in society. And you've got the liberty principle. Everyone wants freedom, right? Everyone wants that feeling of freedom. Libertarians tend to have that one dialed to 11. And then you have this sort of joker card as number 5, which is the whatever you hold to be sacred. Jonathan Haidt calls it the purity versus disgust. And this, again, is very instinctive, right? Some people feel disgust around other people's form of sexuality or sexual perversion from their viewpoint, right? And or what people eat culturally. It's like, oh, that's disgusting. Or the fact that people in Asia think that burping is a sign of respect to the food, and in the West it's disgusting. Like, how dare you make bodily sounds during the meal, you know? It varies from culture to culture what we prize as a sacred value that should not be touched, that should not be challenged, because you're a blasphemer if you challenge it. And this is where I think in America, particularly with this very diverse cultural melting pot, we have to recognize that people are coming with different sacred values. And why are these values so sacred to us? We really shouldn't just be assuming that it's true for me, so it should be true for everybody, right? Because that a lot of cases that's not true. And like the abortion issue is a hot button place where that immediately gets seen. I think that life is sacred. And I think everyone should think that. And therefore, aborting an unborn child at the fetus stage is murder. It's the same thing as murder. And it's absolutely abhorrent to me. And I want to legislate that over other people, even if they don't believe that, because to me, it's ridiculous that they don't feel that way. And what's interesting to me is that if you talk to other people who believe in pro-choice, they think life is sacred too, particularly human life. I have not met anyone who thinks, oh, life is just garbage. Who cares? You know, nobody has that lack of respect for life. It's just how you rank these values against each other, because as soon as you're restricting freedoms around abortion, the liberty principle is dropping dramatically. And so you'll find that libertarians may agree with conservatives on a bunch of conservative issues about limited government and whatnot. But when it comes to abortion, they're diametrically opposed. They're like, hell no, I don't want you constricting my rights around my body and what I choose to do with it.
Building on that argument, it's always been fascinating to me that people who oppose abortion under the theory that all life is sacred very often are in complete support of the death penalty and military. They send their sons and daughters off to serve in the military to kill the enemy. There is something that I would find to be cognitive dissonance in that position, because it doesn't seem to be consistent across domains. But this is, again, one of the curious and interesting points, that we are always adjusting our hierarchy of protected values. And most of that adjusting is at the subconscious level, so that we can actually hold viewpoints which are logically inconsistent without recognizing it. Because most people fall into a kind of situational ethics, depending on who the players are and what the context is. Even though they'd like to think that it's absolutely above board and it's always black and white, it really isn't when you get down into the nitty-gritty.
Right. That's so interesting. And the argument I've heard many times, just the emotion behind the pro-life argument, is that these are the most innocent, helpless human beings in our society. How can we allow them to be killed? As if someone who's a young adult or an 18-year-old being drafted into war and sent to their death so that people can profit off that war is any less evil, right? But it shifts very quickly. Another thing that's like today that's really an interesting point of illogic to me, and people will find a way to argue with me, but the idea of autonomy of your own body against the government when it comes to vaccines, for example, is very important to some people. Like, the government should not be able to pressure or force me into having a vaccine, even if they believe that it creates herd immunity and protects other people who have no immunity once they get vaccinated. But in the same breath, they'll then defend this idea that the government should step in to control women's bodies against abortion.
And on the converse side, women who claim the right to control their own bodies found themselves as very odd bedfellows indeed with the anti-vaxxers, because they were both saying, my body, my choice. So again, this is the problem, that once you create your hierarchy of values, you find inconsistencies that baffle you. Let's return to William James again, because over 100 years ago, he'd already seen some of these issues and the problems that they entail. And his point was, take any group of Christians, even those who all claim to be Episcopalian or Methodist or what have you, and if you dive deep enough, you will immediately find that just scratching a little bit below the surface, each of their Christianities is different. Even though they are claiming to belong to the same church with the same ideals and prophetic notions, it's always coming through a personalized lens. He called this the overbelief, that the beliefs that we espouse are colored. It's like they're coming through this lens of the personality that has to do with our upbringing, our parents, our direct experience of life, the places we visited, whether we were jilted in love. I mean, you name it. All of this colors our experience. And so the beliefs we hold are incredibly personal. And more to the point, they have become utilitarian. They have become pragmatized out of necessity. He said, in truth, human beings, and this goes back to your point, Andrew, about how vulnerable we feel in the face of reality, that we don't like to have our beliefs challenged because we are always in a state of tentative chaos and bewilderment. And the more that we can predict things, the more that we can control circumstances, or at least the belief that we can control circumstances, the happier we are as mammals. We just don't like too much unknown. And so our overbeliefs kind of tame the incoming data and force it into these configurations that are familiar to us, that will fit into our adopted strategies for keeping the unfamiliar at bay. And so every time we look at religion, we have to acknowledge that each one of us has already tailored our moral sentiments, as it were, into these very original moral landscapes, shall we say, so that each of us, along these 5 moral principles that Jonathan Haidt identified, each of us will have a very specific kind of graph of where we have placed these. And depending on circumstance, those priorities will shift again. We'll keep adjusting for pragmatic purposes. And this is the psychological emphasis that's so important to keep in mind, that we are always adjusting our beliefs to accommodate our needs.
Our needs. Isn't this, now, I'm going to back up just a second, perhaps, because it seems to me that a lot of us take our beliefs and we assume that that's who we are, is our collection of beliefs. We identify with those beliefs, which is why we get so defensive when someone challenges one of them. It's like, if I've made a personal mantra, this is who I am and this is what I stand for in the world, and you say, oh, that's not very well thought out, you're going to feel pretty pissed. You'll immediately attack that person. How dare you? How dare you challenge my identity? Because that's built into us. Our self-defense mechanism, our ego, so-called, is automatically geared and ready to protect us against any slight to our character. And so if you're told you're not that smart, or you didn't think that through, it's a personal attack, and we must fight against it, even if they're right, even if we haven't examined our beliefs at all. And I think the underlying thing I really want to say is that we just aren't our beliefs. That
Mhm.
is a false idea.
Right. And any one of us, and when I say that, I think that it's most of us who've undergone some radical transformation of a belief system will recognize that it was, in some respect, an identity crisis. But we realized that the deep self that we were could survive the shattering of old beliefs and find its way into a new set of beliefs. And maybe there were sacrifices that had to be made. I mean, people who change religions often find that their family of origin will disown them and throw them out, that they are no longer welcome in that tribe if they change a religious belief. So sometimes the sacrifices are enormous. But the self, the sense of self, moves with the challenge and change to the belief system. This we know. The conversion experience is so widespread and has so much data behind it. And it's fascinating to read the firsthand accounts of a conversion experience and how your self identification had to adjust as the old beliefs fell away or were ripped away or dramatically exposed, right? You saw the error of your ways and suddenly realized that there was a different truth that at this point you perceived as a higher or better truth. And so you made the necessary sacrifice to jump into a different ship, which often turned out to be a different tribe that you then had to belong to until the next identity shift.
And this is interesting because it would seem to me that there are many people in our society today who have not done a deep philosophical analysis of their belief system at all.
Right.
So they just have a scattering or sort of a constellation of beliefs that are, moving around a little bit, just like stars in the sky, right? But there may be a black hole at the middle that they have not ever seen that really is the anchoring core belief that pulls all those stars into alignment. And that's really what, if one did some deep analysis of their belief system, they might be able to go, I see where these beliefs are moving, and it suggests that I have a deep core conviction around this concept. For me, I think my deep conviction core concept would be that I have this like eternal hope that people will figure it out and get along, that eventually there is some objective truth underneath everything that we may never grasp fully, but that we can be working toward it together if we are willing to release our hardened beliefs and think together.
Okay, that's a very idealistic statement, but let me give you a firsthand story that also points out the challenges to that ideal. I've been a teacher at the university level for many, many years, and one of the first courses I taught was a course called Women and Religion. And I was teaching in Indiana, so I had a lot of first generation college students from rural areas, including very deeply religious traditions that you find in a place like Indiana, which can be very conservative and traditional. One of the women students in my class was clearly very uncomfortable the first half of the semester, just constantly sort of having these almost grimaces, reactions, like shuddering at things that were said in class. And yet she didn't give up. She hung on and became fascinated when we got to the point where I was introducing the history, the ancient history of the goddess traditions that predate the patriarchal Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions. This was something brand new. She had never heard of this, and it frankly blew her mind. But what was very significant was that at the end of class, she came up and asked to speak to me privately and said, I come and have been raised in a very, very conservative Christian tradition in which women are meant to be seen and not heard. We are not allowed to be elders at the church or preach. We obey our husbands and fathers and whatnot. She said, when I came to class and you very frankly told us that you had been divorced twice and still went to seminary to become a minister, and now you were teaching religion and marrying people, and and God had not struck you down. And that's when I realized that maybe everything I'd been taught was not necessarily true. Now, this is an incredibly beautiful and poignant story, and remains one of my favorite memories of being a teacher. That unbeknownst to me, the very presence, my physical being as a divorced woman minister, teacher who had not been struck down by lightning, that in and of itself, I was a walking sermon that challenged everything that she had been taught about her second-class citizen as a female in Christianity. However, if I were to try to have dialogue with the members of her community, let's say the elders of her community, the male elders, for whom their religious conviction that women ought to be second class, I don't think that they would want to converse with me. I don't think they'd want to invite me into their tribe at all, because I am a walking time bomb for them and the way of life that they have established. So here we have the very difficult realization that beliefs are aligned with power. And you cannot forget that every belief has an intrinsic, even if it is unspoken, it has an intrinsic social power structure to it. And those who are in positions of privilege in certain power structures will not enter into a dialogue in which their cherished beliefs could be challenged because it's too much to risk. There is too much at stake. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's not just an open intellectual debate. Their entire way of life. I mean, look at what happened, in the 1800s with the Civil War. You couldn't even debate whether or not Africans should be treated as human beings. They couldn't even think about that philosophically because it threatened their entire way of life to conceive of a Christian necessity of treating everyone as a child of God. They couldn't go there. So I think that is still very true. And if you don't acknowledge the power structures upon which these beliefs founder or continue to sail, then you're kind of naive.
Well, thank you for pointing that out.
Naive and idealistic, but nevertheless, we have to be idealistic, even if it means pushing through our naivete. And sometimes that means saying, I realize that this will challenge the power structure and your place of privilege, but nevertheless, I'd like to challenge you to at least think about it in this way.
Right. And it may be good to point out the history of racism, the history of slavery in America as an example. We got through that. I don't meet anybody today who's arguing that we go back to slavery, especially when you can't choose who's the slave, right? Because of fairness.
We do hear people arguing that we should go back to the time when women knew their place and didn't want to vote and would do what their husbands told them. There are plenty of people still arguing that position.
Yeah, and where is that coming from? Is it coming from a place of God? This new reality is so confusing and stressful and scary for me that I have this nostalgic bias of thinking that it was better sometime in the past. I want to go back to whatever that was because I've got this story in my head that it was really better then. Right?
Well, we don't even have to go back or talk about nostalgia. I think another human instinct is, how could I work things to my advantage? I think it's very much akin to human nature to always be thinking about how you could manipulate situations to give yourself the upper hand. I mean, there was a lot of initial resistance and criticism of the Me Too movement. I was one of those people who was horrified that women were so outraged that they were going to bypass the entire system of justice in order to avenge themselves on their male assailants. They were going to use social media to do a public purge and execution without due process. And in fact, that happened on a regular basis.
Right.
And so I was someone who was very concerned that long suffering tends to extreme reaction. and that women saw that they had a new power that had been placed into their hands, and they were going to use it and damn the principle of innocent until proven guilty by a jury of your peers. To hell with that principle. I've suffered long enough. I want mine now. It's been unfair for too long. I'm going to do justice my way. So now we have the Wild West of the Me Too movement. And even with my sympathies as a longtime feminist, it was hard to stomach what was going down there, because to me, some of those principles must not be sacrificed.
Right.
No matter how desirous the end.
Right. And even though the Me Too movement seems to have cooled off a little bit, that mentality of let's cancel people through social media has not gone away at all. It is completely alive. And now the trans issue is the top issue. And if you speak out against the trans issue as a liberal, you're going to get pounced upon. And everybody knows that. So even though a lot of people may go, I don't know, I think there's a lot of nuance here, but I'm a little concerned about my children being influenced or educated in this certain ideology because I don't necessarily agree with that. That's a grounds for being canceled.
Yeah.
And so we're not having dialogue about the real issues anymore on the left because it would split, it's a splitting point. And that's why the conservatives used that issue so strong politically, because it's a wedge issue that divides Democrats from each other.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of wedge issues because they are so emotionally contagious and inflammatory that we can use those. And as you point out, it can happen on both the far right and the far left, that we fall into tribal beliefs, and the identification with the proper tribe becomes more important than following the nuance of the actual arguments. But again, if you've got too much skin in the game, if there's too much at stake, it's very hard to maintain this kind of objective stance towards something that could have catastrophic impact on your own lived experience. Yeah. So again, let's come back to the original idea that we want to be able to stand in a place, to walk in our neighbors' moccasins for a mile, to try to understand their overbelief, their worldview, their perspective. And that is a noble goal. It will always be a noble goal, because the more we understand, the more likely we are to tolerate, to forgive, to experience genuine compassion. The less we know, the more we're able to demonize, the more likely it is that we will, they're demonic, they are of the devil, they are evil, and there is no good therein. And that's when those walls come up, the blinders go on, and we find ourselves in intractable kinds of conflict.
Right. So it would seem that a huge part of this political polarization in America today is the religious right versus the more secular-ish left, even though statistically there's almost an even number of people identifying as church-going Christians on both sides. Am I right?
That's interesting, Andrew. I don't know whether there are certainly lots and lots of liberal Christian traditions. Myself, as a Unitarian trained minister, I know that there's a lot of humanists and Unitarians and Universalists. The Buddhists, the pagans, they tend to be more liberal socially than the Protestant Christian right. I don't know what the actual numbers are, and whether or not that's a critical piece of this. I think it depends on who's got the megaphone, who's got the political megaphone.
Right.
Well, because the religious right has managed to get itself into the pocket of the politicians in a way that the liberal left spiritual groups have not. They have gone about influencing society in ways that are not overtly political. Right. And that may be disadvantageous, as we're now coming to see.
Right. So, but with this battle, there does seem to be a legitimate complaint from both the secular, that the religious is trying to force its doctrine on secular people, and from the religious, that the secular is trying to force their belief system, their ideological values on religious people. For example, paying your tax dollars are going to go for these abortions, even though you strongly disagree with that even being legal.
I think you've put your finger on it, Andrew, because I think the argument that secular society is behaving as if it were a religious belief system is actually a very valid argument, because the secular mindset has become so dominant and so powerful that it is like now a religious belief system. And so we have to be very careful that we're not adopting secularism and establishing it as a religious viewpoint. And I do believe that we are in danger of doing just that. In other words, our amendment there, that we have to protect religion from the state and the state from religion, really does work both ways. We need to make sure that we continue to protect that place in our society for the religious sentiment, for the moral intuition, for the people who want to live a more deeply spiritual life. The way, here I am living in Indiana, the Amish communities nearby are beautiful examples of how this country has managed to create pockets of space for the deeply spiritual communities to coexist alongside their secular cousins and abide peacefully and with mutual satisfaction for centuries. And I think this is such an important example to lift up. You do not have to convert people to your way of thinking, whether it be secular or religious. It is possible in this big country for all the varieties of religious experience or non-religious experience to find a place for their freedom of expression. And to me, that's the principle that allows both sides to be able to live with a sense that they're being respected in their sacred values, their protected values.
And so what's really called for here is an emotional equilibrium such that I am capable of holding these conflicting ideas in each hand and not throwing the other one away immediately in rage or disgust, but rather go, okay, I have to contend with this other 25%, 50%, 1% of the country. I have to contend with these people who exist in my country and come up with some sort of compromise or a new way through, a synthesis that serves both sides, that serves all the people that we're legislating over, because otherwise it again is a rule by tyranny, and that's not what our founding fathers wanted. It wasn't pure democracy and this idea of the majority rules on everything. It is about this dialogue to find the nuance. How can we navigate a more respectful form of civilization? So what's really dangerous about our times today is that we're not just having these ideological conflicts. We're at a point where people are believing in alternative realities, realities that are not based in fact, but essentially a belief system on the right and the left, and that this is creating no bridge for us to actually have dialogue, to work out our problems and differences. And I find this to be maddening, and I think everyone else does too. It's a scary period. It's enough to come up with conspiracy theories about Russian disinformation, manipulation of our social media and whatnot, and fake news. This has all been part of this building of highly disparate realities, and I think that political tacticians are using it deliberately because it is a way to win. If you just say it's not real, they're lying, even though they've got facts. We deny those facts.
Again,
alternative
this is
facts.
not a new phenomenon at all. Historically speaking, the creation of fabricated realities is exactly the way that every new movement begins. And if you can get enough people to believe in your fabricated reality, you've got a movement. Right? So the beginning of anything that goes against the status quo is going to be seen as outrageous. You could even suggest that when women started demanding the vote, because after all, we are also human beings, most men laughed and thought that they were being hysterical and outrageous and making stuff up that wasn't true. Of course, women aren't like men. They're not fully human. What are you smoking? And so I think this is just how things get started. And once you begin to accept what are considered outrageous beliefs, then you have created a new tribe. If you look at the history of religions, this is how every new religion gets its start. Somebody has one experience that seems very different than the status quo. And if they can get enough people to go along with them, they actually do create a new reality. The New Jerusalem is a new reality. So this is not unusual. This is simply how human beings have figured out how to change the direction of society to move in a way that they want. The American dream is an outrageous fabrication based on completely non-self-evident truths that all men are created equal and have been endowed by their creator by inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Are you kidding? There's no place in the world where that is obvious or self-evident. It's a totally concocted make-believe story. But if you get enough people to believe it and be willing to fight and die for it, suddenly you have the possibility of a new nation. So I don't think we can blame people for making up stuff based on a non-objective belief system, because that's how humans are always behaving. We're always believing things that aren't objectively true. And sometimes that shifts the needle towards something that we would consider a more just world. And sometimes it shifts it in the opposite direction, towards a more authoritarian and less just world, but one that feels more secure because it has authority figures at the top, making the chaos go away. I think that's what you're describing right now, this tipping point of, will the created, the fabricated story of the American dream, in which all of us are created equal and have equal rights to pursue our happiness in the way we see fit, will that outlandish idea win over the idea that this is not a safe place for us to be in anymore? We need to go back to where it was more secure and safer and predictable by having some authority and some rules that everybody subscribes to, where the penalties are clear.
So you're saying both the right and the left right now are losing their sense of this American mythos. The freedom of the individual, the rights of the individual are so important. They're both giving into a more authoritarian mentality around,
or a more tribal mentality. I think both the right and the left are giving into a more tribal mentality. Be with us, be one of us. If you're not with us, it means you're for them. And that's tribal thinking.
Right.
So I think on both fronts, this is the danger, is that we are sacrificing the really interesting experiment that was underlying the American dream, which was the focus on the individual. And this is very anti-establishment in every sense of the word, because in human history, what we see for thousands and thousands of years is Homo sapiens identifying with their tribe. And the tribe may be bigger than, your jungle group. It may be a city-state, as it was in Athens, or it may be an entire nation. But it's still, your worth is deeply tied to the group you belong to. The American experiment was really this radical idea born out of the Renaissance and articulated philosophically in the Enlightenment, that where humans are evolving, that developmentally what we are trying to do is evolve the individual, the human being as an individual with a kind of gravitas and moral center in him and herself that is not subservient to the group, to the groupthink, to the local belief systems. But that requirement, Andrew, places a huge pressure on the individual to evolve their own ability to unite heart and mind, right? Cognition and feeling, to challenge the inherited beliefs and try to discover a place where you can stand. So help me God, I can do none else.
I mean, the philosopher king in and of itself is sort of a mythical thing that we imagine, let alone to demand it of every American. Yes, that's basically what we're talking about.
I think that's unrealistic, right? I mean, the great Swiss psychologist Carl Jung said, the hero path is not for everyone. You couldn't possibly have a society in which everyone is on their hero path. Society would fall apart. The hero leaves society and is a danger to that society because the hero goes to overthrow the old regime. So, it's a very dangerous thing for too much individualism that is not grounded in a deep sense of responsibility, a willingness to sacrifice, and a constant return to the moral instinct that people like Walt Whitman and William James and Emerson so beautifully articulated. That if you don't have the intuition of yourself as a moral human being with that inner compass that's always claiming that you bend the knee to kindness, that is the clarion call of all true religious sentiment. Kindness, caring for one another, right? I mean, the golden rule in whatever guise or wording it comes to you, but that every mystic, the mystical experience, one of the universal characteristics of all mystical experience is the recognition that there are no dividing lines. There is no us and them. That the divine principle is absolutely omnipresent and omniscient. And all of us are particles within the great wave. And this is what is so exciting about reading the mystical experience across different cultures, is that at that point of the genuine inflow of a divine numinous experience, what is shattered are all of the outer constraints that organized religion has placed on the individuals in order to keep them in line, in order to get them to embrace their tribe. That a genuine divine experience unites us with the world. But you can't order up a mystical experience for people. It happens or it doesn't happen. You're awake for it or you fall asleep because it's too numinous and you can't handle it. But I think that, what William James discovered in his beautiful treatise on mysticism is that although the secular mind doesn't have to accept the idea that there is such a thing as the divine, that there is even such a thing as a mystical experience, the fact that it is so ubiquitous, that it is found in all cultures and in all times, means that we cannot dismiss it either. That the secular mind may not dismiss the religious impulse because it is always with us and shows up in every generation and every culture, calling us to something that is deeply intuitive and that seems to have a similar sound in whatever language you're singing. So I don't know how that can serve our purpose of trying to bring better conversations from a converging perspective, except that it is one of those things that is common ground. The mystical experience is common ground. And if we can lift up those kinds of experiences for people across cultures and races and times, it may be a little bit easier to accept the fact of our common humanity, even if we're only talking at the biological or social level, because we share these other impulses in common.
Right. From whatever board we can start building the bridge, we need to start building it right now. And having respect for the people whose words make your ears bleed is the actual requirement right now in order to move forward. Otherwise, we fall back into some kind of civil war.
Just to adopt for your mantra the great claim of Patrick Henry, who said, I may not agree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it.
Yeah.
That's a pretty noble and radical sentiment at the front end of an American revolution, to say this is what we're founding our new country on. The idea that whatever your experience is and whatever rises up out of your genuine heart, soul, and mind, this is a place where you're going to be able to express it. You may not be able to get enough people to go along with you. You may not and will not have the right to make me believe it, but by God, you can say it and I will listen. And I think that's a good place for a starting conversation on a converging perspective.